called Seeing as Symbols and Patterns Made of Qi, which is an awkwardly long title. And the subtitle is even more awkwardly long: Cognitively Valuable Pattern Seeking in Mindful Movement Practices. And so this is a chapter, a late chapter from my forthcoming book, which will come springing forth from the presses on June 2nd of this year. And all of those people will buy the very expensive academic monograph. But the book is called The Philosophy of Mindful Movement, Tai Chi, Qigong Yoga, and the Kinesthetic Imagination. And in the book, I argue that mindful movement practices, understood to include things like Tai Chi, various internal martial arts, practices like Qigong, various forms of yoga, as well as like meditative practices that we'll talk about in a moment, that all these mindful movement practices can be cognitively, epistemically, and philosophically transformative of practitioners. And specifically, I try to show that and how mindful movement practices can amount to ways of thinking, knowing, and understanding. And so, uh, to say a little bit about like the quarry I've got, like what the kind of practices I'm interested in that I call mindful movement practices in the book. I'm interested in practices that involve experienced movement, and the reason for the kind of awkward turn of phrase there is I'm interested in practices that involve bodily movement, but also it might involve merely imagined movement or visualized movement. I don't mean merely imagined movement, but it might be movement that's experienced through imagination or visualization or through the movement of chi, perhaps. But we can talk about them as imagined or visualized. I'm interested in practices that not only have movement, experience movement, but they involve a kind of wild mythic metaphysics. And the use of the word wild here, I'm interested. I'm you taking the concept of wild, like from wild histories of martial arts in Chinese wild histories of martial arts, that histories that are kind of mythic and aren't operating according to like whatever the official standards of historiography might be. I'm sort of borrowing that notion and talking about like mythic metaphysical theories or stories. And I'll explain more about what that means in a minute. These are practices that involve a lot of repetition, both repetition of movement or experience movements within a session, like you do the same movement over and over again in a practice session, but also repetition like day to day, year to year, like over long periods of time. And then the fourth feature is a reverential attitude that the practitioners approach it with a kind of attitude that they're going to be transformed by it and that there's something to be learned from the practices that's not obvious on the surface. So I say a little bit more about each of these kind of quickly, but the four, here's the same four features, but it's kind of exploded out with some bullet points. So the experienced movement that's common to the things that I'm interested in here, it can be either bodily movement, as in like various forms of Qigong or Tai Chi Chuan or Vinyasa yoga, where a person's obviously moving her body in various ways, or it could be visualized or imagined movement. And the kinds of practice that I'm thinking are things like a microcosmic orbit meditation, where you're like somehow experiencing the movement of energy or chi or just movement up the back, down the front of the torso, up the back, over the top of the head, down the front. Various other kinds of Taoist and Tantric or Taoist and Tantric inspired meditations that involve somehow visualizing movement of something or within one's body, or maybe moving one's perspective through one's body. And so like certain kinds of chakra meditations where the chakras aren't really seen as moving, but the practitioner kind of moves her perspective through these parts of the body, count as movement in for the overall picture I'm trying to draw. These wild mythic metaphysical stories, these are going to be stories that are in tension with at least some versions of common sense views of the world and in tension with at least many scientific visions of reality. So the kinds of things I'm thinking about in like the Chinese practices, yin yang theory or five phases, five element metaphysics, in the Indian practices, things that are derived from Ayurveda or whatnot. But these practices are often correlative, either correlative cosmologies or more strictly speaking, correlative metaphysical theories, or else they're symbolic in some way. And they're often soteriological, that they have a kind of promise of some sort of ameliorative transformation that's all kind of all packed in to this worldview that infuses the movement. And then there's repetition and this reverential attitude. And I'm not going to say much more about that right here because I want to sort of make some time. The problem is, though, at least for the overall structure of the book, is like all that stuff, I think, seems like a cognitive and epistemic disaster, or at least it might. I mean, if the main theme of the book or the main argument of the book is that these practices can be valuable ways of thinking and of knowing and maybe even doing philosophy. But like, at least I'll say, unless you've already drunk the Kool-Aid of this stuff, waving one's arms around in various ways and visualizing stuff in the body through some pre-scientific non-common sense, at least for some people's common sense view of the world, and doing it over and over again with an attitude you're going to be transformed by it, seems like not to be a particularly, at least from a certain kind of sober perspective, cognitively and epistemically valuable way of going about thinking and knowing. And so the question I have, one way of putting this sort of central driving question is, how can repeatedly and with reverence experiencing bodily or imagined movement that's understood in terms of these wild mythic metaphysical stories or narratives or theories, how can that amount to a way of thinking, knowing, or eventually doing philosophy? And the quick version of the answer that I give in the book, and I'm going to give you a piece of it at the end, is that I think these practices, they do lots of things. There's lots of things they do. But one of the things they do that I'm interested in is these practices are means of symbolizing or exemplifying the mythic metaphysical stories to oneself and doing it in ways that transform one cognitively and epistemically. And that's what I'm going to try to, that's what I try to unpack. So before kind of jumping into it, I think like at the end of the story I tell, there are two distinct sorts of things that the mindful movement practitioner does with the patterns of experienced movement. And then this isn't the whole story, but then once we get these two things down, like we can tell a particular story about how it functions that I think is, at least not to me, obvious at first. One is they involve symbolism. The practitioner, among the many things she does, she treats the moving patterns that she makes, either in imagination of her body, as symbolic of this or that thing from the background metaphysics. And we'll see it's like that she's gesturing, she's communicating to herself in gestures, things from these background mythic metaphysics. The second thing they're doing, sometimes simultaneously, but it's distinct, is that they're seeing as going on. The practitioner will see the movement pattern she makes as this or that from the background metaphysics. And sometimes symbolism and seeing as go together, but they're conceptually distinct. And that's not going to really make much difference for what I'm going to talk about, what follows, but I kind of want to note that because it will make a little bit of difference. So, a quick outline of what I do in the book, and then I'm going to get to the part that I want to share with you today. After setting the stage like this, I compare and contrast philosophy done in words with metaphysics infused mindful movement practices. I try to say, well, like, can we see these things as doing the same thing? Like you're doing philosophy with the body, right? Can we compare and contrast philosophy done in words with arguably philosophy done through these movement practices, with these metaphysics infused movement practices? And that's in chapter 3 of the book. The end result of that conversation is it's really kind of complicated and it's hard to make the distinction in a fair way. And it kind of sets the stage for other kind of questions. And that's what that does. Then after that, for the sort of main argument of the rest of the book, is I make a series of arguments by analogy, where I draw analogies between mindful movement practices and, on the one hand, things like musical earworms. The case is something like doing these movements or experiencing these movements is like singing to oneself a kinesthetic song. And that kinesthetic song can get stuck in one's mind or in one's body like a kinesthetic earworm. And then I make a case that there's, knowing how and knowing that involved in both musical earworms and kinesthetic earworms. Then I do the same kind of argument with regard to things like fables, proverbs, chengyu, like Chinese four-character set phrases. Like the idea is that these are little linguistic things that one memorizes and that shape one's interactions with the world. And I think these are kinesthetic versions of that. There's a thing from that we actually gave us a paper to one of these sessions a couple years back. Like it's a kind of version of what's called a slow looking practice, but the key part for what I'm going to share with you later is that these are like repetition worthy texts. I talk about like texts that one memorizes or goes back to again and again to try to become transformed by a text. And I say there's something analogous that happens with these mindful movement practices. And specifically, like in cases where one repeats a text to oneself, whether it's like singing a song and they're repeating the lyrics to oneself over and over again, or one like is doing like reading a holy text out loud, or reading a philosophy text again and again, like when one returns to it and teaching it year after year. uh like one of the things that happens is like one often forgets the text or like repeats it without paying attention to the details, or engage experiences what's called semantic satiation, like when you repeat a phrase over and over again and you lose the sense of meaning of it. But then you can come back and be refamiliarized with the text. So like there's these defamiliarization, refamiliarization cycles. And I think that's what really happens a lot of times in these mindful movement practices. It's the losing the focus and then coming back to it is where these cognitively interesting things happen. So that's the sort of central part of the beginning part of the story. So okay, so mindful movement practices have movements at their core, both bodily movement and imagined movement. And the wild mythic metaphysical narratives infuse those movements with meaning, making the moving patterns that a person experiences when doing these practices symbolic. And then once the movements have been made symbolic for the practitioner, or become examples of seeing as the practitioner learns to see the movements as something else, performing the bodily movements of the practices that involve bodily movements is like repeating text to ourselves out loud, and doing the imaginings of practices that consist in imagined movement is like, at some level, repeating these texts silently to ourselves. All of the repetition and reverence that the practitioner brings to it create repeated opportunities to experience the symbolic messages of the movements afresh. That can be cathartic insofar as it creates opportunities to think or to know or to perceive or understand things. And then those opportunities lead to moments of suddenly coming to appreciate or reappreciate meaning. Such moments of sudden appreciation can be a bit like standing in an airport or a theme park and suddenly finding oneself paying attention to messages that are being and have been broadcast over the public address system. Like suddenly one realizes, oh, there's this message here that I've been hearing in the background. Or like realizing that someone's been talking to you and you've not been paying attention. It's a bit like uh, uh, there being a kind of kinesthetic buzz in the background at all points when one's doing the practices, except the kinesthetic buzz is full of messages and of meanings that kind of emerge out of the buzz. However, with the symbolizing that's done with mindful movement practice, like when you're gesturing to yourself, like here I'm giving like an example of a variation of like a silk rolling practice. You're gesturing to yourself and this kind of symbolic meaning to it. Uh, it's not so clearly delineated precisely what pattern is being used to do the representing. So, like if you're repeating a text to yourself, it's pretty clear. I mean, it's not totally clear there even, but it's relatively clear, like what aspects of the sound constitute the carrier of the message, or if you have a written inscription that is, being used to communicate to somebody a set of words, right? You know what pattern is constitutes like the inscriptions that are the words, but like when you're doing these movements of the body, if the practitioner knows they're filled with meaning in there and they're symbolic, it's not always clear how much of the body is involved in making the communication to oneself. And it's also not clear what kind of experiences are the ones one needs to look at. So I'm going to give an example, and I'm kind of jumping around a little bit here, but I think it'll be clear enough. So suppose we're thinking of a Qigong practitioner who you could do it with like a Tai Chi practitioner too, but imagine Qigong practitioner is doing circular movements with her hands and arms as if she's doing like silk rolling practice. And she's aware that the movements represent various things from the background mythic metaphysical story, and that she's supposed to see or experience or think of at least some of them as this or that from the story, but she's not entirely clear what the story is. So one example for this might be she's doing like a silk rolling practice that could have martial applications, but she knows also that at some level when she pushes away, that's a yangishness. And when she pulls back, that's yinishness. And then when she pushes away, the yangishness transitions into yin and comes back. And that she might know like there's a unity of opposites theory, that inside the yang, there's yin to be experienced, and inside the yin, there's yang to be experienced. That's like one way this might go. So imagine our practitioner is doing these movements, and she's repeating these movements, and she's attending to the sensations of doing the outstroke and the instroke. And as she's doing it, she begins to notice like there's like a sense of like inertia as she pushes away, right? At least that's how I would sometimes experience it. Like you feel like parts of the body moving first, and then other parts are dragging behind. And so, like, you might wind up feeling different kind of patterns emerge, going back to Kevin's talk about rhythm, among other things, right? Like, if I'm doing circular movements, I might pay attention to the full circular pattern, or I might also just start paying attention to the pulsing forward and the pulsing back. The pulsing forward and the pulsing back is like one set of rhythms or one set of pattern. And then there's also this circular pattern here that's going on. And so it could be like both of these are ways of communicating content to oneself as one does these practices. And so it might be as if there's like different kinesthetic voices or layers of counterpoint or harmony that the practitioner experiences over and above the base circular pattern of her arm movements. Now, the key here is that anything that she experiences when doing this, especially if she's trained herself to look into the practices and sort of be aware of all that's going on there, anything that she experiences could be treated by her as the thing which she's using to repeat the kinesthetic gestured messages to herself. So whatever she experiences, she could treat it as part of the practice she's doing. And insofar as she's treating the things she does as part of the practice as symbolic of this or that thing from the background mythic metaphysics, she might find ways to discover any number of kinesthetic utterances emerging from the kinesthetic cacophony. And for each of them, she might try to interpret it as if it is a text or somehow the product of a kinesthetic voice telling her something, like in a gestural language. The essential point, at least I'm trying to draw attention to it here, is that the kind of mindful movement practices I'm talking about can easily get a practitioner to look deeply into anything and everything that she experiences during or even after doing the practice, and then to treat any or all of those experiences as some sort of like diaphanous structure that she's barely able to bring her attention to at first. And then the practitioner can then see those diaphanous structures of her experience, either as conveying a message about yin and yang theory or Chinese five phases or whatever it might be, or as being the thing that she's supposed to see as something else in order to get some sort of transformative insight from the practice. Since the mythic metaphysical narratives of mindful movement practice are themselves typically either correlative, as in the case of Chinese five phases theory or yin yang theory, or else treat phenomena that we encounter as themselves being veils or symbols for something else, as here it's more obvious in cases of like yoga practices that might have like a Purusha Prakriti dualism or something of the sort. Once the practitioner thinks or experiences through such experienced diaphanous structures to the mythic metaphysical narratives, or to the world as seen through those narratives, there are even further connections for her to draw and associative experiences for her to bring into her awareness. One's driven by her awareness of the extra causal correlations or symbolic connections that are themselves postulated in the mythic metaphysical narratives that she is symbolizing to herself over and over again by doing these mindful movement repeated patterns. So, this might make mindful movement practice, at least as I'm describing it, amount to a practice of proliferating objects of awareness, each of which might be taken by the practitioner to be symbolic and full of messages, with one on top of the other and layer upon layer of these things. And I think indeed that's exactly what can happen in these sorts of mindful movement practices. The practitioner is invited to do things, and then the things that she does give rise to experiences. And then she's invited to pay attention to all of the additional experiences that she has that result from or otherwise accompany those experiences. And she's invited to to treat each of them as if they are part of the practice. Potentially everything she experiences then, including the meta level awareness of her experiences as experiences, and the meta level awareness of those experiences as themselves being experiences, all in any of those things can count as part of the symbolism or the seeing as of the practice. And then the story itself, which is being symbolized, which is this metaphysical, wild metaphysical story, that 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 which is being symbolized or being used as the lens or filter with which to see things as this or that will then lead the practitioner on to new correlations or things which are thought to be behind a veil or a symbol. I'm almost done, just tiny two more paragraphs. Thus, with mindful movement, the practitioner, the kind of mindful movement I'm talking about here, the practitioner is invited to treat not just the movement she makes in body and imagination, but potentially every experience that she has and can identify that arises along with them, and potentially every experience that comes along with those experiences. She's invited to treat all of that as being part of the symbolism or the seeing as the message that she's repeating to herself over and over again, trying to discern some insight in. All of that, I think, perhaps beautiful. It is also, perhaps, from another point of view, crazy making. It's a little bit like cultivating what psychologists call apophenia, the sort of tendency to see patterns where other people don't see patterns. It's certainly a transformed way of thinking and perceiving, and of knowing and understanding how the world is, according to and even from within the mythic metaphysical narratives. And that's, I think, one of the ways that these practices amount to transformative ways of thinking, knowing, perceiving, and finding meaning in the world. So that's that.